Have you ever been so underestimated that everyone laughed at you, only to prove them catastrophically wrong when it mattered most? What if I told you that a single Labrador retriever, dismissed as nothing more than a pet by battle-hardened German commanders, became the key to unlocking one of the most impenetrable defensive positions in the European theater during World War II? What happened in the Hurtgen Forest in the fall of 1944 wasn't just a military victory. It was a complete reversal of everything the enemy thought they knew about American ingenuity, animal intelligence, and the unpredictable nature of warfare itself. Before we dive into this incredible true story that was buried in classified files for decades, I need your help. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This channel depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these hidden historical accounts to light. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button now. The algorithm doesn't favor content like this, and we need your support to continue uncovering these remarkable stories that changed the course of history. The morning of October 17, 1944, arrived with the kind of cold that turns breath into frozen clouds and makes metal burn skin on contact. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore of the 28th Infantry Division stood at the edge of what soldiers had begun calling the Death Factory. The Hurtgen Forest stretched before him like a prehistoric nightmare, 50 square miles of dense German wilderness where trees grew so thick that sunlight became a memory and every shadow could hide a pillbox, a minefield, or a sniper trained to kill with surgical precision. The 28th had been tasked with what intelligence officers privately admitted was a suicide mission. Push through the Siegfried Line, break the German defensive positions that had held firm since D-Day, and open a corridor for Patton's Third Army to drive straight into the industrial heartland of the Reich. On paper, it was straightforward. In reality, the forest had already consumed 3 American divisions, chewed them up in a meat grinder of artillery, machine gun fire, and the kind of close-quarters combat that turned men into ghosts long before they died. Whitmore had seen 18 men in his platoon reduced to 7 in just 72 hours. The Germans owned this forest. They had spent 4 years fortifying every square meter, turning natural terrain into a deadly maze where conventional tactics meant nothing. Minefields weren't marked on any map. Bunkers were invisible until you were close enough to die. And the enemy had something else, something that made every American advance a calculated risk with astronomical casualties. They had the Call Trail. Intelligence had been hearing whispers about the Call Trail for weeks. Captured German soldiers spoke of it in hushed tones, as if mentioning its name might summon something worse than death. It was supposedly a route through the forest, a path that bypassed the Siegfried Line's heaviest fortifications and emerged directly behind the German command center at Schmidt. If such a route existed, if Allied forces could find it, the entire strategic situation in the Hurtgen would reverse overnight. The hunters would become the hunted. But finding it seemed impossible. Reconnaissance patrols sent into the forest either never returned or came back with casualties so severe that whatever information they gathered died with them in the field hospitals. That was when Corporal Daniel Reeves arrived with Sergeant. Reeves was a dog handler from the War Dog program, one of the experimental units that the military brass privately considered a publicity stunt more than a legitimate tactical asset. The program had been recruiting dogs since 1942, training them for sentry duty, messenger runs, and mine detection. Most officers viewed them with polite skepticism. The Germans, when they learned about America's war dogs through intercepted communications, found the entire concept hilarious. There were documented radio transmissions where German commanders openly mocked the American military for bringing house pets to a professional war. Sergeant was a 3-year-old yellow Labrador retriever, 80 pounds of muscle and energy that seemed comically out of place in a combat zone. He had been donated to the war effort by a family in Boston, trained at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, and shipped overseas with the kind of efficiency that suggested the military was more interested in propaganda photographs than battlefield results. Reeves had been paired with Sargent for 8 months, and he claimed the dog possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect danger, find paths through hostile terrain, and remain calm under conditions that broke human soldiers. Whitmore's first impression was underwhelming. The Labrador looked like every farm dog he had ever seen back in Virginia, friendly, energetic, and completely unsuited for the kind of hell they were about to enter. When Reeves explained that Sargent had been trained for trail detection and could supposedly find hidden paths through enemy territory, Whitmore didn't bother hiding his skepticism. They were fighting the most professional, experienced, and ruthlessly efficient army in human history. The idea that a dog, a Labrador no less, could somehow solve a tactical problem that had killed thousands of American soldiers seemed like desperation masquerading as strategy. The German reaction, when they learned about Sargent, was even more dismissive. Allied intelligence intercepted radio communications from the German command center at Schmidt on October 18th. Officers were literally laughing on open channels, making jokes about American desperation and wondering if the next Allied assault would include circus animals. One particular transmission, recorded and translated by signal intelligence units, featured an unidentified German colonel saying the Americans had finally admitted defeat by bringing hunting dogs to fight the Wehrmacht. The transcript noted multiple instances of laughter in the background, but Lieutenant Colonel Hogan, the 28th Division's operations officer, saw something different. He had been studying reports from the Pacific Theater, where war dogs had proven unexpectedly effective in jungle operations. Dogs could detect ambushes before human scouts saw anything. They could navigate terrain that looked identical to human eyes, but held subtle differences in scent, sound, and environmental markers that trained animals could interpret. And most importantly, they could remain focused and operational in conditions where human cognitive function degraded from stress, exhaustion, and trauma. Hogan made a decision that his superiors would later classify as either brilliantly unconventional or recklessly desperate. He authorized Reeves and Sargent to lead a reconnaissance patrol into the Hurtgen with one objective only: find the Call Trail. The patrol would consist of 12 men, Whitmore would command, and they had 72 hours to either locate the enemy route or confirm it didn't exist. Failure meant the 28th would have to continue frontal assaults through the most deadly terrain in Europe. Success might change the entire trajectory of the war's Western Front. They entered the forest on October 19th at 0300 hours, moving in complete darkness because moonlight in the Hurtgen was a sniper's invitation. Sargent walked point with Reeves, the dog's nose working constantly, his ears rotating to catch sounds that human hearing couldn't process. Whitmore stayed close, his Thompson submachine gun ready, his eyes scanning shadows that could hide German patrols, or worse. The forest at night was a sensory assault. Trees grew so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, even with starlight. The ground was a treacherous mix of exposed roots, hidden craters from artillery strikes, and the kind of mud that could swallow a boot and hold it long enough for a soldier to become a stationary target. Sounds traveled strangely here, bouncing off trees, absorbed by fog, distorted until every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves could be either nothing or everything. Sargent moved differently than Whitmore expected. The dog didn't rush or pull at his lead. He progressed methodically, pausing every few yards to test the air, his body language shifting in ways that Reeves seemed to read like a text. At 0415, Sargent stopped completely, his body going rigid, his gaze fixed on a section of forest that looked identical to every other section they had passed. Reeves raised his hand. The patrol froze, and for 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Whitmore heard it. A faint mechanical click, almost inaudible under the ambient forest noise. Sargent had detected a German S-mine buried in their path, one of the infamous bouncing Bettys that launched into the air before detonating at waist height, designed to maximize casualties through shrapnel that could shred an entire squad. The patrol marked the mine and adjusted course. Over the next 4 hours, Sargent detected 6 more mines, 2 concealed German observation posts, and 1 active patrol route that showed fresh boot prints in mud. The Labrador was reading the forest like a language, interpreting signs that remained invisible to trained human soldiers. Whitmore's skepticism began eroding, replaced by something approaching awe. At 08:30, as dawn light began filtering through the canopy, Sargent's behavior changed. The dog became intensely focused on a specific direction, pulling gently but insistently at his lead. Reeves signaled Whitmore, and the 2 men moved forward while the rest of the patrol established a defensive perimeter. What they found was unremarkable to human eyes, just another stretch of dense forest, thick underbrush, fallen logs, nothing that suggested human passage. But Sargent was certain. The dog moved along a specific line, his nose working overtime, his tail maintaining a steady rhythm that Reeves identified as the Labrador's indication that he had found something significant. Whitmore watched as Reeves released Sargent's lead and gave a hand signal. The dog moved forward slowly, carefully, his path weaving between trees in a pattern that seemed random until Whitmore realized it wasn't random at all. It was deliberate. Sargent was following a trail, one that had been deliberately disguised, camouflaged with such skill that even experienced scouts wouldn't recognize it as man-made. The underbrush wasn't random overgrowth. It had been cultivated to appear natural while concealing what lay beneath. The fallen logs weren't natural forest debris. They had been positioned to create obstacles for anyone who didn't know the precise route through them. Reeves called forward the patrol's engineer, Private Marcus Chen, who had spent 2 years working in his family's landscaping business before the war. Chen spent 15 minutes examining the area, pulling back vegetation, testing soil, studying tree growth patterns. His conclusion was startling. The trail was real, and it had been maintained regularly. Someone had been using this route, moving supplies, equipment, or personnel through the forest using a path that remained completely invisible to aerial reconnaissance or ground patrols who didn't know exactly what to look for. Whitmore made the call to division headquarters using the patrol's radio, kept low enough that transmission time minimized German direction-finding capabilities. Hogan himself took the transmission, listened to Whitmore's report, and authorized them to continue following Sargent's trail. But he added one critical instruction. They were to proceed with absolute stealth. If the Germans discovered that Americans had found the call trail, the enemy would either ambush the patrol or destroy the route before it could be exploited. For the next 18 hours, Sargent led them deeper into the Hurtgen. The trail wound through terrain that defied conventional military logic, crossing through sections of forest that maps marked as impassable, utilizing natural features like ravines and ridgelines to remain hidden from observation. Twice they heard German patrols moving nearby, close enough that Whitmore could hear voices speaking in German, discussing supply schedules and complaint about American artillery. Both times, Sargent froze before any human in the patrol detected the enemy, giving them precious seconds to take cover and remain undetected. The Labrador's ability to sense danger before it materialized became the patrol's lifeline. At 1400 hours on October 20th, Sargent suddenly pressed himself flat against the ground, his entire body language screaming warning. 30 seconds later, A German artillery barrage struck the exact area they would have been occupying if they had continued at their previous pace. The shells were fired blind. Routine harassment targeting meant to disrupt American movement. But if Sargent hadn't sensed something, perhaps the change in air pressure or the distant sound of guns firing, the entire patrol would have been caught in the open. By evening of the second day, they had traveled nearly 8 miles into German-held territory, far beyond the range where extraction would be possible if they were discovered. The patrol was living on cold rations, no fires, no unnecessary movement, maintaining radio silence except for brief scheduled check-ins using codes that would mean nothing to German listeners. The stress was becoming physical. Men's hands shook from adrenaline that never fully dissipated. Eyes developed the 1,000-yard stare that came from hypervigilance pushed past human limits. But Sargent remained focused. The Labrador worked with a consistency that seemed impossible for an animal, never wavering, never distracted, moving along the trail with absolute certainty, even when every instinct told Whitmore they were hopelessly lost in enemy territory. Reeves stayed close to his dog, reading the animal's body language, translating subtle shifts in posture or ear position into tactical information that kept the patrol alive. At 2200 hours, Sargent stopped at the base of a steep ridge line. The patrol held position, while Reeves and Whitmore scouted forward. What they found was a German supply cache, carefully camouflaged but unmistakable once you knew where to look. Crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations were stacked under waterproof tarps, positioned for easy access from both sides of the ridge. This wasn't just a trail. It was an active logistics route, possibly one of the primary methods the Germans were using to resupply their forward positions without exposing supply trucks to American artillery and airstrikes. Whitmore photographed everything using a specialized camera designed for low-light reconnaissance. The intelligence value was astronomical. If Division could interdict this supply route, or better yet, use it for infiltration, the entire German defensive position in the Hurtgen would collapse. But first, they needed to know where the trail led. They continued through the night, pushing human endurance past recommended limits. Sargent showed no signs of fatigue. The Labrador maintained his steady pace, his nose working constantly, his focus absolute. At 0400 hours on October 21st, the trail began descending through a narrow ravine that maps indicated should be impassable due to heavy German fortification. Instead, they found a maintenance path, barely wide enough for single-file movement, that had been carved into the ravine wall decades earlier, possibly during Germany's pre-war military expansion. The path was invisible from aerial reconnaissance, concealed by overhead tree growth and the ravine's natural shadows. But it provided direct access through the Siegfried Line's defensive belt, bypassing pillboxes, machine gun nests, and artillery positions that would have required weeks of frontal assault to overcome. As dawn approached, Sargent led them to the trail's terminus. They emerged from the forest at a position that made Whitmore's blood run cold. They were less than 800 yards behind Schmidt, the German command center that controlled all defensive operations in the southern Hurtgen. They could see enemy vehicles moving along supply roads. They could hear generators powering communication equipment. They were deep inside German-held territory, surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, with no support and no extraction route except the trail they had just discovered. Reeves kept Sargent silent and still, while Whitmore used binoculars to survey the German positions. What he saw confirmed every suspicion intelligence had developed over months of bloody fighting. Schmidt wasn't just a command center. It was the nerve center for the entire Siegfried Line's southern sector. Radio antennas bristled from camouflaged bunkers. Officers moved between buildings with the purposeful urgency that indicated high-level command activity. And most importantly, the Germans clearly considered this position completely secure, with minimal security focused on threats from this direction, because the Hurtgen forest was supposed to be an impenetrable barrier. The patrol withdrew as carefully as they had advanced, retracing the call trail with Sargent again leading point. The return journey took 16 hours of continuous movement, pushing through exhaustion that turned the world into a fever dream of shadows and paranoia. But Sargent never wavered. The Labrador maintained his focus, guiding them back through the maze of German positions, past minefields and patrols, through terrain that would have been a death sentence without the dog's supernatural ability to read danger before it materialized. They reached American lines at 1800 hours on October 21st, 70 hours after entering the forest. Whitmore delivered his report and photographs directly to Hogan, who immediately escalated to Division and Corps Command. Within 6 hours, every senior officer in the European theater was studying the intelligence Sargent had made possible. The plan that emerged from Whitmore's reconnaissance would later be studied in military academies as one of the most audacious tactical maneuvers of the entire European campaign. Operation Silent Thunder, as it was designated in classified documents that wouldn't be declassified until 1998, called for a full battalion-strength infiltration through the Call Trail, bypassing the Siegfried Line entirely, and striking Schmidt from the rear while conventional forces launched a diversionary frontal assault to fix German attention forward. The operation required absolute secrecy. If the Germans discovered American knowledge of the trail, they would either destroy it or turn it into a kill zone. Intelligence officers identified a critical 72-hour window between October 24th and 26th, when German supply schedules and troop rotations would create minimal enemy presence along the route. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain and fog, conditions that would ground German aircraft and reduce visibility for their defensive positions. But there was one insurmountable problem. The trail was so carefully concealed, so dependent on subtle environmental markers and deliberately disguised waypoints, that even with Whitmore's photographs and detailed written descriptions, scouts attempting to navigate it independently became disoriented within hours. The forest looked identical in every direction, without constant reference points that only someone who had physically traveled the route could recognize. Soldiers simply got lost, wandering in circles until German patrols found them, or they stumbled into minefields. There was only one solution. Sargent would have to lead the entire operation. The decision created immediate controversy among senior officers. Betting an entire battalion's success on a dog seemed reckless at best, suicidal at worst. Major General Norman Cota, commanding the 28th Division, spent 4 hours in heated discussion with Corps Command before approving the operation. His decision came down to cold mathematics. Conventional assault on Schmidt would cost an estimated 3,000 casualties with uncertain success probability. Operation Silent Thunder, if Sargent could navigate the trail successfully with a larger force, offered the possibility of fewer than 200 casualties while achieving total tactical surprise. Preparation consumed 72 hours of intensive training. Sargent and Reeves worked with company commanders, teaching them the Labrador's body language, the subtle signals that indicated danger or route changes. The dog would wear a specialized harness fitted with luminescent markers visible only through infrared scopes, allowing the battalion to follow in darkness without using lights that would compromise their position. On the evening of October 23rd, Reeves received a package from Division Intelligence. Inside was a letter translated from German radio intercepts. The letter had been sent from the Schmidt Command Center to Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin, dated October 20th. It was a situation report discussing American tactical capabilities in the Hurtgen. The German author, identified as Oberst Klaus Richter, specifically mentioned intercepted American communications about war dogs. The letter's tone was dismissive to the point of mockery. Richter wrote that American desperation had reached comedic levels, that bringing house pets to combat represented the intellectual bankruptcy of a military culture that prioritized propaganda over professional competence. The letter included a particular passage that intelligence officers had highlighted. Richter claimed that German soldiers found American reliance on dogs to be proof of racial and cultural inferiority, that a serious military power would never demean itself with such theatrical gestures. He concluded by stating that no amount of animal tricks would overcome superior German training, experience, and tactical doctrine. The letter ended with a dismissive joke about whether the Americans would try cavalry charges next. Reeves read the translation twice, then showed it to Sargent and spoke quietly to the dog. The Labrador couldn't understand German military condescension, but he seemed to sense Reeves's determination. The handler had spent 8 months with this animal, watching him perform with consistency that defied explanation, demonstrating intelligence and situational awareness that exceeded many human soldiers. If German arrogance wanted to underestimate what Sargent could do, they would learn the cost of that mistake in blood and chaos. The battalion moved out at 2200 hours on October 24th, 780 men moving in complete darkness through American lines and into the Hurtgen. Sargent led from the front, with Reeves, the Labrador's harness glowing faintly in infrared, visible only to soldiers using specialized scopes. Behind them came Alpha Company, then Bravo, then Charlie, a snake of heavily armed infantry moving through terrain that had killed thousands of Americans in previous months. The weather cooperated perfectly. Heavy rain began falling at 2300 hours, reducing visibility to near zero while providing acoustic cover that masked the sound of 700 men moving through dense forest. Sargent navigated without hesitation, his nose working constantly, his path weaving through the landscape with absolute certainty. Every minefield Whitmore's patrol had marked, Sargent avoided. Every German patrol route, every observation post, every concealed defensive position, the Labrador detected and guided the battalion around with timing that seemed impossible. At 0200 hours, they passed within 50 yards of a German bunker complex. Alpha Company could hear enemy soldiers talking, complaining about the rain, discussing families back in Germany, completely unaware that an entire American battalion was moving through terrain they considered secure. The tension was suffocating. 700 men holding their breath, fingers on triggers, knowing that one noise, one mistake, would trigger a firefight that would destroy the entire operation. Sargent kept moving. The Labrador's focus never wavered, his body language calm despite the proximity of enemy forces. Reeves later described it in his official after-action report as almost supernatural, as if the dog understood not just the mission's tactical requirements, but its strategic importance. The battalion followed, maintaining discipline that would have seemed impossible under such conditions if soldiers hadn't been watching a Labrador retriever demonstrate better operational security than trained human scouts. They reached the supply cache Whitmore had discovered at 0430. Engineers spent 20 minutes rigging explosives with timers set for detonation at 0600, timed to coincide with the diversionary frontal assault. The destruction of German supplies would create chaos in enemy logistics exactly when American conventional forces would be pressing hardest against forward positions. The trail descent through the ravine tested human limits. Moving 700 men single file through a maintenance path barely wide enough for individual soldiers, in complete darkness, with rain making every surface treacherously slick, should have resulted in catastrophic accidents or noise discipline failures. But Sargent set a pace that somehow worked, not too fast to cause accidents, not too slow to risk detection. The Labrador seemed to understand that he was leading not just Reeves, but an entire military formation through the most dangerous infiltration of the war. At 05:45, as dawn began breaking through heavy cloud cover, Sargent led the battalion to their final assembly position, the same ridgeline where Whitmore's patrol had observed Schmidt. Battalion commanders used the remaining darkness to position their companies, coordinating attack vectors, confirming radio frequencies, synchronizing watches for the assault that would begin in exactly 15 minutes. Major Douglas Brennan, commanding Alpha Company, later wrote in his personal diary about those final minutes before the assault. The entry was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 2003. Brennan described standing on that ridge, looking down at German positions that had no idea American forces had completely bypassed their defenses, and watching Sargent sitting calmly beside Reeves, the dog's tail wagging slowly as if this was just another training exercise in Nebraska. Brennan wrote that in that moment, he understood why ancient armies considered certain animals sacred. Some creatures possessed qualities that transcended normal understanding, bridges between the natural world's intuitive wisdom and humanity's strategic thinking. At 0600 hours exactly, the world exploded. American artillery began pounding German forward positions in the diversionary assault. Simultaneously, the explosives rigged at the supply cache detonated, destroying months of German logistical preparation. And 700 American soldiers erupted from the forest behind Schmidt, attacking a command center that had considered itself invulnerable. The German response was chaotic. Officers ran from buildings trying to organize defense against an attack direction they had never prepared for. Radio operators broadcast frantic requests for reinforcement, while American forces systematically destroyed communication equipment. Vehicles attempting to escape ran into Alpha Company ambushes. Within 40 minutes, Schmidt had fallen, its defensive coordination shattered, its command structure decapitated. But the real impact went far beyond one command center. With Schmidt captured, the entire Siegfried Line's southern sector lost its nerve center. Forward positions that had been receiving coordinated fire support and tactical direction suddenly found themselves isolated, cut off from higher command, facing American assaults without the sophisticated defensive coordination that had made the Hurtgen so deadly. Within 72 hours, German forces began withdrawing from positions they had held for 4 years, abandoning the forest rather than risk encirclement. The strategic consequences rippled through the entire Western Front. Patton's Third Army, which had been stalled by Siegfried Line fortifications, suddenly had an open corridor. The Hurtgen Forest, which military planners had expected would cost tens of thousands of casualties over months of fighting, was effectively neutralized in less than a week. And German High Command, reviewing intelligence reports about how Schmidt had fallen, discovered that their defeat had been orchestrated by the very war dog program they had mocked. The intercepted German communications from the days following Operation Silent Thunder revealed an organization in shock. Multiple radio transmissions, recorded by Allied signal intelligence and archived in classified files, captured German officers trying to understand how an entire battalion had infiltrated through terrain their own generals considered impassable. When reports confirmed that an American military dog had led the infiltration, the tone shifted from disbelief to something approaching respect, mixed with fear. One particular transmission, sent from Wehrmacht headquarters to field commands on October 29th, specifically referenced the American War Dog program and ordered all German forces to treat American canine units as legitimate tactical threats, requiring the same defensive consideration as armor or artillery. The transmission included instructions to immediately report any intelligence about American dog deployments, to prioritize elimination of war dogs during engagements, and to stop all mockery or dismissive attitudes toward enemy animal capabilities. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done, both militarily and psychologically. German soldiers who had laughed at American dogs now faced an enemy that had demonstrated capabilities beyond conventional military doctrine. The psychological impact was devastating. If Americans could use dogs to bypass Germany's most sophisticated defenses, what other unconventional capabilities did they possess? Sargent and Reeves were quietly withdrawn from frontline service after Operation Silent Thunder. The decision came from the highest levels of military command. The dog had become too valuable, too strategically important, to risk in conventional combat. Intelligence officers recognized that Sargent represented something unprecedented, an animal that had directly altered the trajectory of major military operations. If the Germans captured or killed him, the propaganda value alone would be significant. The official record becomes deliberately vague after October 1944. Sargent's service file, declassified in 1998, shows transfer to a training facility in England, then returned to the United States in February 1945. Reeves received the Silver Star for gallantry in action, though the citation was carefully worded to avoid specific operational details that remained classified for decades. But there are other documents, harder to verify, that suggest a different story. A partially redacted file in the National Archives, discovered by researchers in 2007, references something called the Shepherd Program. The file indicates that after Operation Silent Thunder, military intelligence identified approximately 30 dogs from the War Dog program that demonstrated capabilities similar to Sargent's. These animals were supposedly recruited into specialized units that operated in classified roles throughout the remainder of the war and into the Cold War period. The file includes testimony from handlers who claimed their dogs could detect enemy positions through methods that defied conventional explanation, that these animals possessed sensory capabilities or intuitive understanding that exceeded anything in existing animal behavior research. One handler, identified only as Corporal M. Harrison, stated in a 1946 debriefing that his dog had successfully predicted enemy artillery strikes minutes before shells fell, that the animal could sense danger across distances that made standard sensory explanation impossible. The implications were unsettling enough that the program was apparently discontinued in 1952, and all records were classified at levels that still haven't been fully declassified even today. What happened to the dogs involved remains unknown. What capabilities they actually possessed remains debated. Whether the program actually existed or was disinformation designed to confuse Soviet intelligence remains unconfirmed. What is confirmed is Sargent's fate. The Labrador was returned to his original family in Boston in March 1945. He lived with them until 1952, dying peacefully at 9 years old. The family donated his collar and service records to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where they remain on display in the Price of Freedom exhibition. Tourists walk past them every day, reading the small plaque that identifies Sargent as a war dog who served in the European theater, never knowing the full extent of what that service entailed. Reeves returned to civilian life, worked as a veterinarian in Oregon, and refused to discuss his wartime service in any detail until 1997. In his only recorded interview, conducted by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, Reeves spoke carefully about Sargent, describing the dog's intelligence and capability in terms that suggested deeper knowledge he couldn't or wouldn't share. When asked directly if Sargent possessed abilities beyond normal canine capability, Reeves paused for nearly 30 seconds before responding that some things about the war remained beyond his understanding, that he had witnessed events that conventional explanation couldn't adequately address. The interviewer pressed, asking if Reeves believed Sargent was somehow special, perhaps even supernatural. Reeves's response was recorded verbatim. He stated that after 8 months working with that dog, after watching Sargent navigate impossible terrain, detect dangers before they materialized, and remain focused under conditions that broke human soldiers, he had concluded that some creatures exist as reminders that the world contains more than human understanding can fully explain. He stated that Sargent taught him humility, showed him that intelligence and awareness take forms we don't always recognize or appreciate. Reeves died in 2001 at age 84. His family donated his personal papers to the Oregon Historical Society. Among those papers was a letter Reeves had written but never sent, dated October 1944, addressed to the Boston family, who had donated Sargent to the war effort. The letter thanked them for their sacrifice, explained that their dog had saved hundreds of American lives, and then included a paragraph that the Historical Society initially considered removing from the public archive due to its unusual content. In that paragraph, Reeves wrote that he believed Sargent had been sent to him for a reason, that their partnership represented something beyond random military assignment. He wrote that in the forest, leading 700 men through impossible darkness, watching the dog navigate with certainty that defied explanation, he had felt the presence of something larger than human warfare or military strategy. He wrote that Sargent moved with purpose that seemed guided, that, in the worst moments of the operation, when everything should have failed, the dog's focus suggested awareness of forces or influences that Reeves couldn't see, but that he believed were absolutely real. The letter concluded with Reeves stating that his experience with Sargent had fundamentally changed his understanding of existence, that he had entered the war as a skeptic and emerged as someone who recognized that the material world represents only part of a larger reality. He wrote that serving with that dog had been a spiritual experience disguised as military duty. The German perspective on Sargent's role emerged slowly through captured documents and post-war interviews. Oberst Klaus Richter, the officer who had written the dismissive letter about American war dogs, was captured by American forces in December 1944. During interrogation, Richter was shown intelligence about Operation Silent Thunder and informed that the American dog he had mocked in his letter had been directly responsible for the operation's success. According to the interrogation transcript, archived in the National World War II Museum's research collection, Richter's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by what the interrogator described as visible psychological distress. Richter repeatedly stated that such a thing was impossible, that no animal could possess the capability to lead a battalion-scale infiltration through the Hurtgen. When shown photographic evidence and detailed operational reports, Richter became silent for several minutes before stating that if what the Americans claimed was true, then Germany had lost the war the moment they chose to mock rather than respect their enemy's unconventional capabilities. The interrogator noted that Richter seemed particularly disturbed by the spiritual implications. The German officer stated that European military tradition held certain superstitions about animals in warfare, old beliefs that some creatures served as avatars for forces beyond human control. He stated that his grandfather, who had fought in the First World War, had spoken of similar incidents, animals that appeared during critical battles and seemed to influence outcomes through means that defied tactical explanation. Richter said he had dismissed such stories as primitive superstition until confronted with evidence that perhaps the superstition contained truth. His modern military education had been too arrogant to consider. The interrogation transcript ends with Richter making a statement that interrogators found sufficiently unusual that they noted it specifically in their report. He said that armies throughout history had learned a hard lesson that each generation seemed condemned to relearn. Pride in human capability, in technology, in doctrine, in supposed superiority, creates blindness to realities that don't fit comfortable assumptions. He said the Wehrmacht's mockery of American war dogs represented that blindness, and the cost had been catastrophic not just militarily, but spiritually. A reminder that the universe operates according to principles that human arrogance can never fully control or understand. After the war, Richter became a professor of military history at the University of Heidelberg. He published several papers examining unconventional warfare tactics, including a 1963 article titled "The Tactical Implications of Animal Intelligence in Modern Warfare." The article carefully analyzed Operation Silent Thunder without specifically naming Sargent, concluding that military organizations ignore animal capabilities at their strategic peril. But the article's final paragraph shifted into philosophical territory unusual for academic military analysis. Richter wrote that his experience studying the Hurtgen Forest campaign had convinced him that warfare represents a uniquely clarifying environment where reality strips away comfortable illusions. He wrote that soldiers throughout history have reported encounters with phenomena that suggest the material world exists within larger frameworks of meaning and purpose that peacetime thinking tends to dismiss. He concluded by stating that future military planners would be wise to remain humble about what is possible, to recognize that the most decisive factors in warfare are often those that conventional doctrine cannot anticipate or fully explain. The story should end there. With Sargent retired, Reeves returned to civilian life, and the war concluded. But there are persistent reports, difficult to verify, that suggest the story continued in ways that remain officially unacknowledged. Multiple veterans who served in Korea and Vietnam have reported encounters with military working dogs that demonstrated capabilities reminiscent of what Sargent showed in the Hurtgen. These dogs supposedly possessed navigational abilities, danger detection, and tactical awareness that exceeded standard training explanations. A partially declassified CIA document from 1972, released through Freedom of Information Act requests in 2015, references something called Project Canine Intuition. The document discusses research into whether certain dogs possess sensory or cognitive capabilities that could be systematically developed for intelligence operations. The research apparently produced inconclusive results, though sections of the document remain redacted under national security exemptions that don't expire until 2045. Veterans advocacy groups have occasionally petitioned the Department of Defense to fully declassify records related to the Shepherd program and Project Canine Intuition, arguing that whatever these programs involved, the information should be available to the public after so many decades. The DoD response has been consistent. Officials state that certain military capabilities and research programs remain classified not because the information is particularly sensitive, but because declassification would require resources not currently available. Critics argue this explanation is deliberately evasive, that the real reason involves information that would raise uncomfortable questions about what the military discovered regarding animal capabilities and what that discovery might imply about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of reality itself. The truth, whatever it is, remains locked in classified archives, waiting for either declassification schedules that stretch decades into the future or researchers determined enough to navigate bureaucratic resistance and uncover what actually happened. What we do know with certainty is that one Labrador retriever, dismissed and mocked by an enemy that considered itself militarily superior, demonstrated capabilities that changed the course of a major battle, saved hundreds of lives, and forced military organizations worldwide to reconsider assumptions about animal intelligence and unconventional warfare. Sargent's story asks uncomfortable questions. If one dog could demonstrate such extraordinary capability, how many other animals throughout history have influenced events in ways we haven't recognized because we weren't looking or because we dismissed what we saw as impossible? If intelligence and awareness take forms we don't fully understand, What does that mean for our assumptions about consciousness, about purpose, about the nature of existence itself? These questions don't have easy answers, but they demand consideration, particularly in a world where human arrogance about our own capabilities continues to shape decisions that affect millions of lives. The Germans learned in the Hurtgen forest that mockery of what seems impossible can prove fatal when the impossible turns out to be real. Perhaps that lesson extends beyond military tactics into broader questions about how we approach mysteries that don't fit our comfortable categories. And perhaps, just perhaps, the story hasn't ended. Perhaps somewhere in classified archives, or in experiences veterans haven't shared, or in capabilities still being developed in secure facilities, the work that began with Sargent continues. Perhaps there are those who understand that the material world represents only one layer of reality, that consciousness and intelligence manifest in forms we're only beginning to recognize, and that the next great leap in human capability might come not from technology, but from learning to work with, rather than against the extraordinary capacities that already exist in the natural world, waiting for us to become humble enough to acknowledge them. In a world that often feels like it's losing touch with deeper truths, perhaps we need to remember that the most profound wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected sources. A Labrador retriever, navigating impossible terrain in the darkness, taught 700 soldiers to trust what they couldn't fully explain. Perhaps that lesson extends to all of us. Perhaps the path forward, through whatever darkness we face individually or collectively, requires similar trust in guidance that doesn't always make immediate sense, but that proves reliable when we have the faith to follow it. This is where stories like Sargent's point us toward something beyond history or tactics or even animal intelligence. They point us toward recognition that we live in a reality far stranger, far more meaningful, far more purposeful than materialist assumptions allow. They point us toward humility about our own understanding and openness to possibilities that our culture increasingly dismisses. And ultimately, they point us toward the source of all wisdom, all guidance, all purpose, the God who created both human and animal, who instilled in creatures like Sargent capabilities that defied explanation, who guides those willing to listen through darkness that seems impenetrable but that yields to trust and faith. If a dog could lead soldiers through impossible terrain to victory, how much more can the Creator lead us through the impossible circumstances of our own lives toward purposes we cannot yet see, but that we can trust are real? That is the deeper story here. Not just military history or animal intelligence, but an invitation to recognize that we live in a universe of meaning, of purpose, of guidance available to those willing to acknowledge their need for it. Sargent's legacy isn't just tactical doctrine or the lives he saved. It's a reminder that miracles happen when we stop insisting on understanding everything and start trusting in wisdom greater than our own. Follow God. Follow Jesus Christ. Because in a world that increasingly mocks faith as primitive superstition, perhaps it's time to remember that the Germans mocked Sargent too, right up until the impossible became devastatingly real. Some truths reveal themselves not through argument, but through events that shatter our comfortable assumptions and force us to acknowledge that reality operates according to principles our pride can't contain. The question is whether we learn from those revelations or whether we, like the Wehrmacht in 1944, dismiss what we should have taken seriously until the cost of our arrogance becomes unbearable.